Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton's best weekend of 2023 ended in the worst possible outcome. Their strongest challenge against Red Bull and Max Verstappen yet ended in a disqualification for a rare breach of a near 30-year-old rule, with Ferrari falling foul of this as well. Red Bull was checked for the same offence, hadn't made the same mistake, and therefore Verstappen's victory stood. Conversely, Hamilton was stripped of his second place at the United States Grand Prix just a few hours after chasing Verstappen closely in his upgraded Mercedes in easily his and his team's most competitive showing of the season, while Ferrari's Charles Leclerc got excluded from 6th place at the same time. Their cars breached the same technical regulation that refers to the thickness of the plank assembly under the car, with a minimum thickness of 9mm accepted after a competitive session due to wear. It put a dampener on a much improved weekend for Mercedes, even if there were a few factors behind dominant world champion Verstappen almost suffering a rare defeat, but we'll come to that shortly. The plank rule that caught out two of F1's best teams has existed for almost 30 years, since the 1994 German Grand Prix, part of a raft of safety-driven initiatives in the wake of the deaths of Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger at Imola that year, so it's not exactly one that either team could plead ignorance over. An instant high-profile victim of the new rule was Michael Schumacher, who lost victory in the 1994 Belgian Grand Prix because of excessive plank wear on his Benetton. Nowadays, the plank is checked at the peripheries of the holes in which titanium skid blocks are inserted. It's been the source of constant scrutiny and controversy since the new ground effect rules were introduced last year, as teams have kept playing games or been suspected of playing games with skid blocks that submerge into the floor or have insulating material between the plank and the floor body itself. It's led to the regulations being adjusted a few times in the form of technical directives, most recently after the summer break this year, and it all comes down to the same point: teams want to run their cars as low as possible, especially in this rule set. But why were Mercedes and Ferrari specifically caught out at Austin? An obvious factor is the sprint weekend format for this Grand Prix. It's reasonable to contend that neither Mercedes nor Ferrari would have tripped up on a normal weekend with 3 free practice sessions. But the single 1-hour practice session before qualifying on Friday, when car setups had to be locked in and parc fermé restrictions applied, complicated things, especially on a track like this, which is particularly bumpy. Mercedes was convinced this was what had gone awry in its case and caused higher than expected wear levels, especially as it was running an upgrade in the US that had to be evaluated in Friday practice. Coincidentally or not, this was a new flaw. Basically, by not running a full race fuel load in Friday practice, having to make educated guesses about the severity of the bumps, and then using the curbs aggressively throughout the Grand Prix, judging the ride height is an inexact science. But it's the same for everybody, and as Mercedes team boss Toto Wolff admitted, others got it right, Mercedes got it wrong, and there's no wiggle room in the rules. The stewards pointed out in their verdict that it is the responsibility of the teams to ensure the car is legal. And there have been occasions when teams have broken parc fermé on sprint weekends because of fears about plank wear, for example Alpine in Baku this year. But making those kinds of changes means having to start the race from the pits. In hindsight, both Ferrari and Mercedes would have taken that compromise. Without knowing what was coming though, they unwittingly locked themselves into this Sunday outcome with their setup choices on Friday. The FIA conducts extensive legality checks in post-race scrutineering and publishes a full list of everything that is checked. This stretched to 4 pages worth of items after the United States Grand Prix, but it's impractical to check absolutely every aspect of all of the cars, so the FIA has to apply some discretion. For example, every car is weighed for obvious reasons, but only the Red Bull of Sergio Perez, the McLaren of Lando Norris, and the AlphaTauri of Yuki Tsunoda was subjected to a battery of surface aerodynamic components or bodywork tests like the floor edges and front and rear wings. As for a physical floor and plank wear inspection check at Austin, only 4 cars were assessed: Leclerc's, Hamilton's, Norris's, and race winner Verstappen's. You'll notice that this means 1 car from each of the top 4 teams was chosen. That's not a coincidence. Usually the choice of cars is random, but the FIA can pick specific ones too if it wants to check cars that have looked close to the legality limit in recent races, for example. But also, the floor and plank aren't always on the to-do list, at least based on what the FIA discloses. As far as we can tell, the last physical floor and plank wear inspection carried out post-race was in Singapore, on Verstappen's Red Bull and Fernando Alonso's Aston Martin. No cars had this check in Japan or Qatar, presumably because the risk of plank wear was perceived to be a lot lower, and that is because circumstances also play a part in what the FIA looks at and when. As the disqualified teams acknowledged at Austin, the nature of the circuit and the sprint weekend format clearly created the potential for some plank trouble, which makes it likely that the officials specifically wanted to check the leading cars for compliance. But there are no provisions for sister cars to be checked once an infringement has been found. So unless Hamilton and Leclerc were just plain unlucky, or their teammates' cars were running slightly higher ride heights and would have been found to be in compliance anyway, it's possible that Ferrari and Mercedes have also avoided what would have been disqualifications for Carlos Sainz and George Russell too. And there could be other teams or cars further down the order who have got away with it because they simply were not checked. Given there's often been a lot of attention on Red Bull's dominant RB19 and questions over whether various technical directives over the last 18 months or so could hurt its performance, you might wonder why two slower cars got caught out, but the dominant one is just fine. First of all, this isn't a case of Red Bull getting away with something that others are being punished for. It's got away with nothing. As we've mentioned, Verstappen's car was checked and it was compliant. With the RB19, Red Bull has often enjoyed the ability to run low without triggering the porpoising of other cars, which is probably a function of its sophisticated floor design and more compliant rear suspension. But it has made plank wear a potential limitation at some tracks. Other less sophisticated cars were finding porpoising problems well before they got so low that the plank was an issue, so this has been on Red Bull's radar for longer than other teams. Plank wear concern played its part in the team's Singapore difficulties, for example, and in Belgium, Verstappen and Sergio Perez were lifting every lap before Eau Rouge to avoid smashing the plank as the car compressed going up the hill. So in unique cases, such as with the Austin track surface, the Red Bull can no longer run lower than the others, because everyone's limitation becomes plank wear, and even Red Bull increases its ride heights accordingly. That cost Red Bull some of its aero efficiency, forcing it to run a bigger rear wing just like the others, and blunted some of its performance advantage, but crucially, it ensured legality. On the subject of Red Bull, it's worth understanding that the ride height compromise was one of several reasons contributing to Verstappen winning by only 2.2 seconds at the checkered flag. He had also only started on the third row after getting his best lap deleted for a track limits infringement in qualifying, had to make his way past other cars while looking after his tyres around a circuit with high tyre degradation, and had a braking problem which then compounded into some tyre temperature difficulties. During his march to the front of the field, Verstappen had to take care to preserve his rear tyres, having hurt them to a degree passing the Ferraris, but of more concern was his feeling on the brake pedal, which from very early in the race just felt quite wooden. There was no feedback coming through it, so he couldn't feel if it was his fronts or rears on the point of locking, and as he braked conservatively because of that, he began losing front tyre temperature, causing a vicious circle as it increased the likelihood of locking the fronts. Despite all of that, Verstappen prevailed, and he wasn't disqualified either, which all leads into one final thought. Does the optimism around Mercedes' upgrade that followed such an encouraging result immediately after the race stack up in the cold light of day? As Mark Riley said in the Race Members Club, in order for Hamilton to almost beat a Red Bull, Verstappen had to start 6th and have brake issues, and Mercedes also ended up with an illegal car. Framed like that, it does take the edge off what clearly looked like a very effective floor upgrade, which brought performance but also gave Hamilton in particular a lot more confidence. Hamilton had felt this is where a bigger step in pace came from. He was able to lean on the car and extract more of its potential than before. We've heard countless times this season and last year too that Hamilton and Russell have been limited by an unpredictable car that they often don't feel that well connected to. This was different in Austin, but understandably many onlookers, as with the comment in our members club, are now wondering whether the upgraded floor played a part in the disqualification and how much the performance could have been influenced by running so low as to induce illegal amounts of wear. Of course it's possible that the upgrade was a factor, as it will have affected the way the ground effect floor works, but realistically it's not a substantial enough change to have caused this outright. The lack of setup time with the new spec could have led to problems, but given Ferrari, without any upgrades this weekend, also hit trouble, it's far more likely to be external conditions that led to the excess wear than a specific change on the Mercedes. As for how much difference it made to performance, it's true that running lower can make the ground effect floor work harder and therefore generate more downforce, but there's nothing to suggest that the Mercedes or Ferrari were running in a ride height range that would have transformed their pace either way. What's more, if you run the car too low and hit the ground, that can have a negative effect on performance. Teams are also cautious about plank wear because it's almost inevitably an instant exclusion, so it would be absurd to deliberately take the risk just because it confers a performance gain. Hamilton said in a quote issued after his disqualification that it doesn't take away from the progress made with the upgrade, and the team described itself as cautiously optimistic that the step will still translate into future races. Only in Mexico and other Grand Prix will we and Mercedes know for sure.